This is Center Stage, putting your firm in the spotlight by highlighting business owners and other industry experts to help take your firm to the next level. Hey everyone, and welcome to Center Stage. I'm your host, John Henson, and this week talking about storytelling and just why it is such an important component to your firm's marketing strategy. If you followed us for any amount of time, we talk about how important it is to just make that emotional connection with people rather than just berating them with constant calls to action and making sure that they know your phone number, but using story to make that connection and make them feel like the hero of the story rather than yourself. And we can dive into a lot of those elements today. We're joined by Chris Vander Kaay from Brain Trust Legal Group. If that name sounds a little familiar, he works very closely with one of our recent guests, attorney Darryl Isaacs. So happy to have Chris on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So yeah, quick introduction. What do you do over at Brain Trust, and why is the storytelling element so important for you?
Well, so at Brain Trust Legal Group, I am the creative director, which essentially means if there's a story to be told or an angle to be figured out or an ad to be produced, I'm involved in some capacity. Basically, if anything needs to be written, my fingers touch it at some point. That first of all, is one of the reasons why storytelling is so important to me, because I'm working with writing constantly. But the other reason is that's actually where I came from. I did not start in the marketing arena. I began as a screenwriter and an author, and then for a few years, even a professor. So much of my training and my focus for many, many years was about being able to effectively, concisely tell a story to people and have them be affected by it. So,
yeah. Yeah, I love that because I kind of have a similar background in that regard. I was very much convinced that my career path would just be in some sort of creative field, writing, even teaching. I thought that I was just going to go on to be kind of an adjunct professor teaching writing courses and all of that. And then I get into marketing. But what I have found is that, marketing tends to take two different kinds of people. You need an analytical person who can really sift through a lot of that data, really understand how to make adjustments based on ad campaigns and all that. But then you also need the creative people who can tell those stories, who can craft really good copy. And oftentimes I have found that you can't find that in the same person.
For sure. Sometimes I would even say that you might be better off finding the creative person because it's harder, and then teaching them the technical aspects from someone who knows it, because it's much more difficult the other way around. To get someone whose game is numbers and then have them move into the creative space is very difficult. Yeah, you said something interesting too, which is you and I started in the same field and both ended up in marketing, probably because the field that we loved was not the one that was paying the bills that well.
Right. Yeah. It was definitely going to be a much bigger grind for sure. So, but let's jump into this. So, we're talking about, kind of marketing strategies of the past. Actually, the previous episode that we did talking about, or maybe, no, that was a webinar I'm thinking of. I'm doing so much, I can't keep track of it. But, past marketing strategies, maybe you have a billboard, maybe you have an ad in the yellow pages. It's going to be the same thing for however long that billboard stands or until the next edition of the yellow pages comes out. It's going to be the same message, and it's going to be pretty limited. Like, you can't really tell much of a story in just that one single image, and probably mostly because you're trying to get your tagline there and you're trying to get your phone number there to make it really obvious for people to call you. So why is it that storytelling has become so much more effective than just some of that stuff that firms used to do?
Well, so first of all, I do think certain things like, case results and giving out your phone number more than once, I think those things can be effective. So I just want to be clear. I'm not telling attorneys don't do this, but
right.
To your point, yes, I do believe that storytelling is more effective in many ways. And one of the reasons is because stories are effective because they work the way that a human brain works, right? Our brains are not a long memory tape that we can rewind and access at any point, like a recording. Our brain tends to for ease of memory, divide things into chunks, memories that are connected to emotions, connected to events. So stories already exist in the same shape that memories do. So they're actually easier to remember. For example, like John, if I put you on the spot, if I asked you right now, what were you doing on December 23rd of 2020? Honestly, we could probably sit here. We'll cut this chunk while you're thinking, but like you could sit here for a while and eventually you would get there, right? But the problem is I asked you something based solely on facts and numbers and a timeline. If instead of saying it that way, if I said, John, how did you spend the first Christmas of the pandemic? I've essentially asked you the same question because December 23rd was 2 days before Christmas in 2020. But what I did was I put it into a different place in your brain. What I now asked you was, tell me the story of John Hinson's first COVID Christmas, right? You're now suddenly remembering memories that are related to a narrative, right? Of we had to drop presents off on someone's porch, or everybody was masked at Christmas, or we couldn't get together, or we did a Zoom Christmas, whatever that is, that immediately springs to mind because you've attached emotions and a narrative to it. So using storytelling makes a memory so much more effective because you've connected it to something that makes it stick in their brain. Lawyers often use tricks like repetition and music and things like that to try and get something to stick in a person's brain. But sometimes finding in a compelling narrative will do it far more powerfully.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was really such a great example because I'm sitting there like, the first question around it's just like, oh God, what really was I doing? But then you flip it around and, I don't know if it's just because I am more creatively minded, but I mean, it just came immediately. And I think that does, the way you kind of explained it does work that way for a lot of people. And, kind of to your point, the repetition and there is a place for a lot of that other stuff, a catchy tagline, a good jingle, stuff like that, but to me, I like to equate it to just like a recipe for something, right? Like you need a little bit of this, you need a little bit of that, but you put too much salt in the cake, you're going to have a weird tasting cake. Right. But yeah, no, absolutely. Whether it's, case results, a good tagline, making sure that your phone number is visible, all of it's important for sure. But I think, what you pointed out psychologically and in making that connection, especially with the emotional connection, because even if people are not necessarily, even if people don't necessarily classify themselves as an emotional person, that emotional connection is still really, really strong and really easy to make that connection with.
Yeah. Well, and also there are numerous different kinds of emotions, and people may not consider themselves to be emotional because the emotions that they tend to utilize are not considered what we would call the dramatic emotions, right? But curiosity, wanting to solve mysteries, that's actually an emotion, right? Like that sense of curiosity. So when you do an ad that starts with something like, insurance companies are lying to you right now in 3 ways, right?
Yeah.
By starting with something like that, you've just like piqued someone's brain in a way. If they just started listing terrible things about an insurance company, well, no, put the mystery first, because then you incite that curiosity. That's an emotional reaction from someone,
Yeah, absolutely. And, the kind of the advantage I think that a lot of legal and even, financial firms have is that people, when they're seeking out those businesses to work with, they're in what's more likely a more emotional situation, right? Whether it's family law, maybe they're going through a divorce or they're having some sort of custody issue, bankruptcy, there's a lot of fear there. Estate planning, there's a lot of sentimental stuff going on there in terms of legacy and family matters involved in that. And so there's a big opportunity, I would say, for legal and even financial firms, more than most businesses, to really be able to use story to make that sort of connection and be more effective with the way that they're positioning their firm.
Yeah, well, I think people within an industry often forget that people outside of that industry don't understand much about that industry.
Yeah.
So if they can't understand what you do for a living, they need to understand why you do it, right? And that's what storytelling does well, is presents a why instead of a what. Because a lawyer could make a video that very clearly explained the process of estate planning. But wouldn't it be better to just be able to express the idea that you were terrified that you would pass away and your kids would not be taken care of, and now we have a solution to that so you can rest easy? It's not about the what that I'm going to do. It's about the why of how your emotional problem has been solved.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the big things that I see a lot happening is I think, a lot of lawyers, they default to trying to create that sort of content for other lawyers rather than whoever they're actually going to get paid by, because for one reason or another, maybe because they're trying to impress them, maybe they think that that's what's going to help send referrals their way, whatever it is. But yeah, being able to frame that content, whether it's a blog article, a video, whatever, so that you're telling that story and making that connection, explaining that why more so than how. Because and I don't know if you've seen this or not, but I tell lawyers a lot, like, your audience doesn't care about getting super deep into the weeds on a concept as much as you do. They would rather feel good about knowing that you understand and can empathize with what they're going through more so than the really deep technical aspects of their specific situation.
Yeah. I mean, if they wanted to handle the case themselves, they would do it, right? The
Yeah.
goal is they want to hire somebody who will do all of this so they don't have to think about it. In fact, this is tangentially connected, but one of the things I thought Darryl did that I thought was genius in his intake process was at the end of the intake process, he starts asking for reviews. People normally wait till the end of the process, but he started doing it then because of the sense of relief that someone has that you're taking on their problem for them. They don't have to think about
Yeah.
it or deal with it anymore, leads to good reviews. But it reflects what you're saying. They
Yeah.
don't want to know all of the steps of the process, right? They don't want to see how the sausage is made. They would like to
Right.
have the sausage at the end when it's done.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, uh, I think, we're talking a lot about, kind of the individual touch points and ongoing stuff, but we got to start at the beginning as well. In terms of a lawyer or a firm in and of itself, trying to figure out what their overarching story is, where do they fit in the story arc of each individual person, right? One of the things that we're big on is kind of that Donald Miller story brand concept, right? Where you have the hero, you have the protagonist of some sort, whether it's a person or a hurdle or whatever it is, and then you have the guide that comes along and helps the hero overcome the challenge. And for those who aren't familiar, the idea is that for a long time, a lot of business owners, lawyers especially, made themselves the hero of the story, when in reality, they are more of the guide and their client is the hero of the story. And one of the things that I hear a lot is that, a lot of firm owners think, well, I'm not special. I'm boring. I'm just a lawyer, maybe in a small town. I don't really have anything. So how does someone try to begin to figure out what their unique story is? And how they can really position themselves in that unique way to start being that guide for people.
I mean, it's a great question. It's super important because if you don't have that, then you have it's sort of a loose cannon, right? Like it's just firing in many directions, and hopefully it hits something, but you don't know for sure. I feel like there are two questions that I think attorneys should ask themselves, and then one very important realization that I always sort of put out there. So the two questions I think you ask yourself in order to figure out what your story is the first one is, what made you become an attorney, right? If you can't figure out how to tap into what made you passionate about the industry that you got into, you'll never be able to impart that energy to someone else, right? So there has to be some connection to what drew you to this to begin with. Now, if it's solely money, then yeah, probably we don't want to use that as your angle. But rarely does anybody get into a field as complicated and with as much studying as necessary just to make money, right? They're doing it for some other reason. So there's some kernel of who you are and why you're drawn to this that's important to your story. And then the second thing is not just why did you become an attorney, but what do you do differently than other attorneys, and why do you do it differently? Because what that does is it sets you apart, and it gives you the reason that you're set apart. For instance, if you started a firm and you decided you wanted your employees to be able to work remote, and the reason for that is because you've witnessed a lot of lawyers who had firms that were okay but not great because they were limited to the number of people that could drive to their office and sit inside of their office, right? Well, there's something to that. That tells you something, which is you started to understand that the greatness of your firm is not defined by the ability to get everyone in the same office and keep an eye on them. It's about finding superlative people who can drive themselves and are motivated to do their jobs, right? that tells you something about your personality, about the firm's personality, and perhaps about the brand that you're building, right? Now that you have that, you can figure out, how do I leverage that into advertising in some way?
Yeah.
And then the last thing I'll say is that important realization I was talking about, which is that
Yeah.
it's everybody has to remember that what forms you as a person is also what forms you as a business person, right? Nobody goes into becoming a business person who is not first a human being. And so what has formed you as a human also informs a lot of what you do as a business person. And if you can figure out what that is, you can find the human story behind the decisions that you make as a business person, and then it becomes relatable. Like going back to that story we just had about remote work, that might have had something to do with being raised in a household where your dad was in the military and you only ever got to talk to him on Zoom, but those Zoom calls were so important to you and you were able to connect to someone who you otherwise wouldn't have been able to, and found that this unique communication was effective in still being able to keep people close and caring about each other, right? So finding that unique human angle to put on a business element, that gives you a direction to start pointing your story in.
Yeah, I love that. And so many great examples there, especially as you were talking. I think, when it comes to figuring out what the story is, I hear, I've, in my experience, I feel like it's been easier for people who may have started in a different industry and then went to law school later and became a lawyer later on, because there was some sort of, really important experience that they had. You talked about maybe, someone who may have done it for the money. Another one that I see is just like, everyone in my family has always been a lawyer, so I just followed in their footsteps. Have you encountered that kind of person before? And is there some sort of way to extrapolate a unique story out of that?
Yeah, well, that's where I think you would lean into the second question, right? Which is, what do you do differently than other attorneys, and why? If your road was always going to be become an attorney, then you probably had spent a lot of time around attorneys, both the ones in your family and also any that were in the firm, or any that were at events that you went to, or law school or whatever. So now it's not so much a conversation of, why did I decide to become an attorney? Because that was sort of, the road has been paved for you. You were Prince William. You always knew what job you were going to get. But you're probably going to do it differently than other people. And the reason for that is because you've been exposed to certain things that you liked or things that you didn't like, and you knew to be drawn to some and drawn away from others. Those are the things that will help you define who you are as an attorney, more so than what made you become an attorney to begin with.
Yeah, and it's funny, like I'll have some of these conversations and I'll almost kind of hear a random attorney voice in the back of my mind, and like I keep coming up with all of these extra questions, are like, well, what about this? Or what about this? And it's not that I agree with you. I am 100% on your side on this, but I've also had these conversations with attorneys where it's like, well, I don't do anything different. Like, I just serve my clients. And so, but like, I know that cause you've talked about it, kind of reframing things in a different way really helps uncover a lot of that stuff. So now it's like, okay, now we're 3 layers into this. Maybe I just did it for the money, or my family was always lawyers, but then I do things the way that they've always been done. I don't do anything special. Okay, what now?
Yeah, well, and in that case, I would probably point out that maybe you're not talking to enough other lawyers, because I guarantee you are doing things differently than other attorneys. If you haven't talked to enough, then you maybe don't recognize that, because you're only seeing that you do it similar to people in your firm. But one of the great things about going to coaching or being part of like Darryl's mastermind groups is you're opened up to a ton of different perspectives and methodologies, and you start to notice, like, some you're like, oh man, that's a brilliant idea, I'm going to try that. Others, you instinctively, for some reason, know that's not my vibe. I don't want to do that. I'm not interested in that thing. Well, that's when you start to explore. You got to dig in on that. It's not just the yes or no of the what. It's the why. Why do I not want to do that? That's where the gold is. Because once you start to explore the why of any question, you will start to hit on answers that I've always said, the great thing about statistics is that they tell you what happened, right? But it's almost always asking what. It's just telling you, like when you look at a spreadsheet, it's telling you what happened in the past. If you don't ask why, it does not help you moving forward. It only tells you what previously took place. When you start asking why, it starts building answers that potentially will change future behavior. And that's the power. That's the power of why, which is actually one of the things I'm going to talk about at the summit that I think lawyers need to lean into. They don't talk about why much in their actual job, but they really need to do it in their life and in their marketing and in their business. Even if you can't do that in court, You can't brainstorm as to why a client did something, but you absolutely should be brainstorming on the why for everything else that's not related to that.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I would almost even question whether or not they understand the audience that they're serving. Because it almost comes from a place where they're making some assumptions about how they're going to be perceived, more so than maybe even how they feel about themselves. And so I would always just like push to make sure that they understand the pain points that their audience is going through and what their audience is expecting from them in return, and then figure out from there, well, what are you doing that helps solve that problem once you can kind of fully understand that.
Yeah. No, it's fantastic. What you just said is fantastic. The idea of understanding the audience is so important to everybody who's trying to sell a good or a service to anyone, but in particular, it's so important to lawyers, because frequently what lawyers will end up doing is selling. How do I put this? This is a nice way to put it. You need to sell them what they want so that you can provide them what they need. Lawyers are frequently trying to make them take what they need instead of selling them what they want, right? Nobody wants an attorney. I'm sorry, guys. The truth is no one wants an attorney, right?
Yeah.
People need an attorney. They don't want a divorce. What they want is a new life or freedom, right? They don't want an estate plan. What they want is a security for their family and not to have to think about dying, right?
Yes.
So you need to sell them what they want. They will hire you and then you can do what they need, but you have to find them in the place they are before you can get them to the place that you need them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, talking about how to begin figuring out a story and all of that, obviously there's a lot of marketing involved in that. And I think, being able to craft that story starts with how your firm is branded and positioned in the first place. And so a lot of times, people kind of separate the branding and the marketing into two separate things. In your mind, what is the big difference between branding and marketing?
So, well, first of all, for my opinion, the most effective branding and marketing are the ones that are done in tandem when you can do them together.
Mm-hmm.
However, they are two distinctly separate things, and they can absolutely and frequently are done separately, right? So take marketing first. The goal of marketing is to get someone to buy a product or a service, right? Mm-hmm. It can absolutely be done without branding. For example, we've all seen lawyer commercials that say something to the effect of, have you or a loved one been exposed to harmful chemicals in your drinking water? You might be entitled to compensation, call this number, right? At no point was anything ever branded there. Right. No attorney's name. Really, you're not direct. Often it's because those are lead generation companies or places that are trying to put mass campaigns together. So it's not coming from a specific attorney. But in that case, no branding was done, but you were marketing a specific product or service. The opposite is true too. The goal of branding is to make a company or a person synonymous with quality in their industry, meaning making them the ideal or the chosen option. And that can also be done without what I would consider direct marketing. For example, nowhere in a Coke ad is there a web address or a QR code where you can go online and buy Coke right then, right? They're not actually trying to sell you a can of Coke right then. What they're trying to sell you is the idea that Coke is the best soda, so that whenever you need a soda, you will grab a Coke, right? So there's slightly different purposes. Basically, the difference between hunting and farming. Hunting is you need to shoot something and eat it right now. Farming is you need to plant seeds and then it's going to grow and it's going to feed a lot of people for a long time. Now, you can do both together, though. Like you could do, for instance, Darryl does a commercial and he says, were you hit by an 18-wheeler? You need to call the hammer. One call, that's all, right? So at the beginning, he's drumming up a very specific kind of case, which is a truck. But the second half, he's branding himself as the hammer and he's using the phrase of one call, that's all, to get that brand out into the world. So he's hitting both at the same time in a single ad. Those, for me, are the most effective because a lawyer is not like Coke, but a lawyer can be like Coke in the sense that Darryl has social media and people are constantly just tagging him when they read an article about somebody in Louisville that was hurt. He got a case, a Denny's sign was blown over and landed on someone in Elizabethtown. And the way that he found out about it is that someone that lives 15 minutes from where it happened had won a prize from him on social media, knew who he was, knew what he did, and just tagged him and said, Hammer, you should help these people. And he got the case solely because of that, right? That's only branding that does that. He could never have found that case without getting that heads up from somebody. And that was all due to branding. Yeah,
absolutely. I love the example that you gave really about Coke, because I mean, like, this is what we do. Like, this is how we serve, the clients that we work with. It's not constantly selling to people. It's not, providing that specific example or whatever. Like, again, like you said, it works in tandem. Totally do that. That's not where our expertise is, but it's creating what we call it, creating that top of mind awareness so that you're literally unforgettable. And so that when someone needs something, you're the first person that they think of. Same way that, your example of Coke is, where it's like, anytime someone wants something to drink, Coke would be the thing that they end up wanting, or, and going to get. So, I love that, because I think a lot of times people think of branding just solely as like logo, color scheme, maybe a tagline, and it's just kind of like a singular sort of foundational thing. But really, the branding, and obviously the marketing, but the branding side of things, to be really effective, is an ongoing thing that you're constantly, putting out, reminding people of, like, this is who you are and this is how you help.
Yeah. And it's the tougher sell too, because most branding, when it's effective, is difficult to trace back to a single source, right?
Yes.
So it's why it's troublesome to do the job that I do, because I have to sell just as much the idea that you need to keep doing it, even though the results are not going to be clearly connected directly to this, right? Darryl knows at this point that branding works for him because so many people know him as the Hammer, but he can't draw it back to one source that has made someone understand that he's the Hammer. It is the collection of material that he has created over years using that same brand consistently that has made it happen.
Yeah. And that's honestly like what has been a big difficulty for us, because a lot of lawyers, especially, they want that hard ROI. They want to be able to make that clear connection, and it's just really tough to do it. We say we're going to, broadly speaking, the idea is that it generates more referrals. So if you're able to track your referrals, and you can make that connection in a lot of different ways there. You've mentioned Darryl a lot. And one of the things that, almost, at least in my experience, almost more so than other industries, is, for lack of a better term, coming up with a gimmick, whether it's a character, a mascot, Darryl's the Hammer, I've seen like the Bulldog, or like the Legal Eagle, or whatever it is like that. And a lot of times, one thing that I really like about how Darryl has kind of taken his, is that it isn't his entire personality, right? Like, it's a thing that he's taken, he's run with it, and that's great. But it's almost not even the primary focal point of his message or his marketing. Like, he's still able to connect with specific situations. And so when someone has that, and I'm not saying don't do it, I think it can be a great marketing tool, but how do you prevent that gimmick from becoming an overall distraction from the actual story that you're trying to tell?
Yeah, no, 100%. It happens all the time. You'll see attorneys that are doing some sort of a stunt they know will get attention, but it doesn't ultimately add up to anything bigger. Like, I'll give you an example of, I will frequently describe ads as, I can see this is a marketing distraction versus a marketing gimmick, right? A marketing distraction is, if you've ever seen, like, on social media, it'll be a shot of like, it's like a pitcher on a mound, and then they throw the ball and the ball just comes shooting towards the camera, right?
Yeah.
And then it says something like, do I have your attention? And then they talk about something else, right? That's just a distraction. That's just trying to grab someone's attention from other things and focus it on you. But ultimately, it doesn't end up connecting to whatever your message is. So the problem is, it doesn't make for anything memorable, because aside from the second that it grabbed your attention, you're never going to remember how that thing connected to whatever it was someone was trying to say to you. Whereas, let's say this is attention getting, right? You're watching a video of a huge guy choking another man, right? Choking him out. And this guy's like hitting his arm, trying to get him to stop. And eventually he just passes out. And then the guy lets go of him. Well, when he drops the guy, you notice that this huge guy that's been choking the other guy out has a shirt on, and the shirt says alimony, right? Now what you've done is you had a great attention-getting moment that someone was paying attention to, because someone was choking someone else out. But that thing that got the attention was also tied to what ends up being an ad about a divorce attorney who's trying to help someone get rid of these alimony payments that are choking them to death, right? So what the difference there is, the second one is a gimmick, the first one is a distraction, because one doesn't connect and the other one does. So I always think of a brand as being like a Brita water filter, right? Like, the idea is that impure water goes into a filter and out the other end comes pure water. Your brand should be operating the same way, that any idea that you have should be filtered through your brand to see, does it fit your brand? And if not, how can it either be altered to fit or just be excised from it, essentially? Like you mentioned, Darryl being the hammer. Many years ago, Darryl was the heavy hitter before he was the hammer. Now, he didn't switch over. He switched over for legal reasons, I believe, because it was owned by someone else. Anyway, the reason I'm glad he switched is because if you're the heavy hitter and you're going up against insurance companies, that's fantastic. If you're the heavy hitter and you're taking a wrongful death case, there is still a bad guy, but the heavy hitter doesn't sound like something that's great to say when you're trying to get a wrongful death case, right? Because you're trying to be more sensitive, and that sounds weird. The great thing about the word the hammer is that while we do have the connotation that a hammer is used to smash things, like smash through red tape and smash insurance companies, the thing about a hammer is that it actually has, its primary purpose is not to destroy things. Its primary purpose is to build things.
Yes.
So Darryl's brand works whether you want it to be I'm smashing the insurance companies, or whether you want it to be I want to help you repair your life. I want to help you get back on the track. I want to help. I want to build or rebuild for you, right? So what he has done very smartly, whether it was intentional or not, was he found a brand that allows for a broader use of it for multiple purposes that still fit within the larger branding that he has done. And for me, that's, you're always filtering it through your brand. So it's smart to find something that you can use to balance out, think about, this is not just like, is this going to work in commercials, but like largely for every practice area that you have, for every kind of ad that you're going to run, is this an image or an iconography that's going to work everywhere, because it's going to be everywhere. So
yeah, absolutely. And so, I think kind of the final point that I want to hammer home, for no pun intended, was that I think especially in my experience, most lawyers are those analytical people that we talked about at the start of the show. They very big on decision making, numbers, hard ROI. The creative side, the story side may not necessarily come natural to them. So to your point, find coaches, work with people, see what other people are doing, and really work with someone to kind of develop that for you, and then run with it and really embrace it. And so how can people get in touch with you, learn more about what you and the people over at Brain Trust are doing?
Well, first of all, I appreciate you not only having me on the show, but giving me the opportunity to mention that. The first thing I will tell you, for anybody who's interested in this content that we're talking about, Brain Trust Legal Group is actually putting on a summit, the BLG Summit 2023. It's August 24th through 26th in Nashville, Tennessee. And it's a live in-person event. It's called How to Build a $1 Billion Law Firm. And it's Darryl and, well, many people, but there's six firms there, or six heads of firms that have built $1 billion law firms. And they're talking to you about a lot of their secrets. In particular, though, I will be actually doing a presentation there called Exponential Law Firm Growth and the Power of Why, which we just sort of touched on tangentially here. But I think a very important way of shifting your mindset of how to look at everything within your law firm through the lens of why, to be able to solve problems, to create content, to do all kinds of things that wouldn't have occurred to you if you weren't asking that question. So I think that's one thing that would be fantastic. For anybody who's interested in that, you can just go to summit.braintrustlegalgroup.com to check out the tickets there. And then I would also say, I mentioned them earlier, the mastermind groups Darryl has. He has 4 mastermind groups. I think it's a total of over 50 attorneys at this point over the 4 groups. We get together on Zoom calls every month, and then also we do 2 in-person events a year. We get together for 2 or 3 days, and everybody from all the firms presents on what's going on with them. So they're really vulnerable. They share things that are working, share things that are not working, put red flags in the air, all kinds of stuff. So you can get an enormous amount of value from that. And then also we do a $1 billion coaching program, which is, anybody who wants to grow their firm and is looking to figure out what those best practices are. Darryl has been very successful over 30 years and over $2 billion recovered for his clients. And he does a coaching program that's sort of a mini version of the mastermind where people share, but he also does a lot of instruction to just teaching people stuff that, he's learned, that spent a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of heartache on sometimes learning. So hopefully you can avoid. But all of those are available. If you just go to braintrustlegalgroup.com, you can find out more information about all of them. But I would say a great place to start is the summit, because it's a single event. Hopefully have enough advance notice that you'd be able to book the time. And I think the value of being able to interact with people who are that successful and that willing to share can make a huge impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as someone who has participated in masterminds and has seen the work that all kinds of coaching can do for people, it is one of the best investments that you can make into your firm. I see, the difference in the firms that attend, the more business development related conferences, not just your annual bar conference where you have to get your CLE credits, but the extracurricular stuff, your ABA tech shows. I know Clio's got a great conference. The Brain Trust Summit, probably right up there with in terms of the value and the quality that you'll get from it. And it's just, the investments like that are going to take your firm so much farther. And so, one final question for you before we wrap up here. If you had one final piece of advice for our listeners, what would it be?
Oh man, boil it all down to one piece, huh? All right. So I would say for honestly, this is just for business in general, not just for attorneys. When it comes to marketing, there's how do I put this? Trying to sound nice. Your story is important, but try to figure out how to tell it without talking about yourself so much.
Yes.
The people who spend time talking only about them and what they have done lose audiences quickly. When they talk about their lives in relation to what they can do for you, right? I'll just give you the fastest example I can think of. Darryl often tells a story of the accident that he was in. He was in a very serious accident in 2015. He got a brain bleed. He has a TBI. Shoulders were yanked out of the sockets. Seriously, he genuinely for 8 days they thought he was not going to walk again, right? Very serious accident. Darryl doesn't bring that story up to brag about anything. He brings it up because it helps him to understand what his clients are going through, and that's how he shares his narrative. So he only talks about himself in aid of what I can do for my client. So think about that. Think about how you can relate to people, but make sure you're relating to them and not just talking about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with that. Well, Chris, a lot of great information. Hopefully it didn't sound very manipulative coming from our end, just, two branding guys, talking back and forth. Like, it's not like we sat there and planned this and like, oh, how are we going to both agree on everything? Like, no, like there's a reason that this stuff works. Is because you got people all over who are doing it and it's working for everyone. It just so happens that we connected and you were able to share a lot of your insight. And so hope, as always, it was helpful for everybody. Please continue to rate and review the show wherever you are consuming it. And that's going to do it. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. To learn more, go to spotlightbranding.com/center stage.